Hello. Right, the first thing I need to say is the session is now being recorded, so everyone is aware of that. Can you all hear me? My name is Osmond, and I'm an expert by experience with the Commission on Social Security. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. We've had a lot of bookings for the webinar, which is fantastic. Some people are here as individuals and others are from a very diverse range of groups and organisations. We're really pleased about this because the theory of change the Commission follows says one way big change happens is when lots of different individuals and groups all start saying the same thing. Consensus building is of vital importance. If you'd like to introduce yourself to everyone else, please feel free to do that in chat. Information about today has mentioned the work of the Commission and our plan for a decent social security system. The plan proposes a guaranteed decent income, increased child benefit, a new disability benefit to replace PIP, and an approach that says prevention is better than cure. As well as making these proposals, we also know we need new, positive and persuasive ways to talk about social security to get away from the stigmatising of benefits and benefit claimants that has gone on way too long. So we are delighted that Nicky Hawkins from On-Road Media has been doing research on this, and today she's going to present her findings. Before I hand over to Nicky, there are 4 things I need to emphasise. First, we have 2 British Sign Language interpreters with us today. Live captions are enabled. We will have a break partway through the session, but there is a lot to get through in the webinar with plenty of talking and slides. As I've said, the session is being recorded, so if at any point you want to dip out, please do so, and you can then watch the recording when it's convenient for you. Second, if you have a question for Nicky, please put it in chat. Nicky will be focusing on her presentation and won't herself look at chat, but one of my Commission colleagues will pull out questions for Nicky, which she will then answer at points during her presentation. Third, chat is the main way for you to ask questions, but at any point during the session, you can also email the Commission coordinator, Michael Alton. This morning, Michael sent you an email with the link to join this session, so you can just reply to that email and Michael will see it. Fourth, we'd like to thank Trust for London, who funded the Commission and also funded Nicky's work. Access costs are funded by Citybridge Trust, and support for this event has also been provided by the London School of Economics. We are very grateful to them all. That's everything for me, and I will now hand over to Nicky and switch off my camera and mute myself.
Thanks, Osmond, and hi everyone. I'm Nicky, and it's great to be with you today. I'm going to jump into sharing my screen, my presentation in a minute. I've got several spots during the course of the session for us to take some questions and reflections, but I'll focus on doing my presentation outside of those spots. And just to let you know that I can't see the chat whilst I'm talking. So if there is anything that's not clear, please do pop it in the chat and I will pick it up when we get to the moments when we're pausing. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. And hoping everyone can see that. We are here today to talk about talking effectively about social security. And I am joining you from an organisation called On-Road Media, who I hope many of you will be familiar with. For those of you who don't know us, we're a charity using communications to change the world. We work with people and the media. We work with people who have lived experience of issues, professional experience of issues, and we connect people with the media to deliver better conversations, better content, better reporting, and better storytelling of big issues. So we have a project that focuses on poverty, hardship, social security, and earlier this year, probably in the spring this year, I was really delighted that we were approached by the Commission to support them with this piece of work. So what we're going to cover today, our goals for today, are to talk about why we need to frame the conversation around social security, what this is all about and why does it matter. We're going to share the research that we did. So we carried out a small piece of research but had some really interesting findings. First of all, we're going to talk about what we heard during the research. We'll take a quick break. We'll then talk through the recommendations resulting from the research, and we'll make sure that we have plenty of time to hear your questions, thoughts and feedback. So I'm going to jump straight into that first section. Why do we need to frame the conversation about social security? So this is really core to my work, which is focused on effective communications and effective framing. So I often get asked kind of, when it comes to these big issues and big stark challenges that we face in society, really we have a job to do, and that's just to tell people what's happening and tell people what's going on. And so why does it really matter how we say it? Is that really what we should be focusing our efforts on? And it's my belief that how we say it and how we talk about issues really matters and can sometimes make all the difference. So I'm going to share with you a piece of research, nothing to do with this project, fairly old piece of research that I think illuminates this issue of it really does matter how we say things and how we communicate things. And that was some research that was done looking at the effect of the way that hurricanes are named in the US, in America. So you'll have heard the kind of big high profile hurricane names, and you may have picked up that there is an alternating pattern of giving hurricanes male sounding names and female sounding names. And some researchers wanted to look at what effect this has had. What difference does it make? It's been going on since the 70s. There's quite a lot of historical data. So they ran some different forms of research, and they concluded that female named hurricanes were 3 times as deadly as male named hurricanes, which is a pretty stark difference. And they wanted to work out why. So they checked that didn't so happen that hurricanes that were given a female name were suddenly more kind of more dangerous and more kind of vindictive in terms of their features. It was all to do with the subconscious reaction that people have to hurricanes based on the names that they're given. So when people hear, Hurricane Jane is coming, it's a really serious one, they don't take it as seriously as maybe when they hear about Hurricane Bob, and they're less likely to evacuate, less likely to take precautions. And this means that over time, female named hurricanes have had, much associated with a much greater loss of life, which is pretty stark. And it tells us that what we call things and how we talk about things really does make a difference, because it affects how people hear us and how people hear what we have to say. And sometimes we can be saying something really loudly and we think we're being really clear, but we can inadvertently be having some quite counterproductive effects in terms of what people are actually hearing and how they're interpreting based on some subconscious reactions. And that's because as human beings, we think in story. We jump to conclusions based on the stories that we hear and the way that they're presented. And some researchers who explore human cognition recently did a big kind of meta-analysis of how people think and how people interpret information. And I pulled out a line from their work, which I thought was particularly important. So they say humans cannot spend a moment of their waking life without making inferences. They can spend hours or even days without ever engaging in reasoning. So this idea that we all think in stories and we make sense of the world through stories and through inferences and by jumping to conclusions, rather than by kind of thoroughly analysing the information that we're presented with, is really important to how we communicate issues. Because if we want to communicate effectively, if we want people to hear what we have to say and understand what we have to say in the way that we intend, we have to know where people are going to go with the the information that we share and the way that we share it. And we have to be able to navigate these stories in people's thinking. And that's what our work at On Road is all about, understanding the stories that surround us, the stories that we hear in the media, the ways that we have conversations, and thinking about how we can promote better stories and different ways of having conversations about big issues. Because we know that it is not just a question of setting people straight with the facts, and that sometimes correcting or attempting to correct stories can backfire and can have some quite harmful effects. So we often see an approach to communication that looks a bit like this. You know, you have people recognizing that there's some unhelpful, inaccurate stories and some ways of talking about issues that are not based in truth and reality. And people will say, look, here's a myth. I'm going to tell you this myth. I'm going to talk about how wrong it is. And instead, I'm going to set you straight with lots of detailed factual information as an attempt to rebut that myth. And what lots of research shows, and lots of experience, I would say, suggests, is that this can backfire because repeating false claims and echoing stigmatizing language can actually activate unhelpful perspectives, even if we're attempting to challenge them. So simply by giving that language and those stories and those ideas more airtime, we're kind of making them stick further in people's heads. So when we see communications like this, you know, a poverty mythbuster, which is attempting to, you know, out of sheer frustration around the inaccuracies that can be found in the sort of media and public debate, you know, point out those myths and then dislodge them with the facts. We know that these might not be having the intended effects and may actually be continuing a cycle of a conversation being had and thinking going in a particular direction. Because repeating ideas can make them stick. So some really interesting research looks at the effect of repetition on how people think and feel. And it shows that repetition increases the likelihood that a statement will be judged as true. So psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. And this applies equally to obviously true statements and obviously false statements. So the kind of plausibility or how true something feels like it might be is no guarantee that something will be or will or won't be judged as true, and that being more knowledgeable doesn't make us any less susceptible to this. So we tend to think that actually, you know, people who hold more knowledge are maybe less likely to succumb to fake news or to succumb to the effects of information being repeated and therefore sticking in their heads, whereas actually this is just something that applies to all of us because we're human. So repetition is extremely powerful in communications, and when we are repeating ideas in order to debunk them, we're actually helping them to stick in people's heads. And I'll say it again because it's important. Repetition increases the likelihood that a statement will be judged as true. So it really matters how we frame information and how we communicate information and how we tell stories and the way that we frame issues. So some people may be familiar with the song Eat, Sleep, Rave, Repeat. I like to say eat, sleep, frame, repeat. We need to tell effective stories about how issues work and what the solutions to them are, and we need to keep repeating those stories. Because when we do that, we know we can have powerful effects with communication. We can drown out inaccurate or stigmatizing stories, and we can move the conversation forward. Because the stories that we think in can change. And I want to be really hopeful about and really kind of clear that there is, sorry, I've got someone, I've got some echo on the line. I hope you can all still hear me. That's a bit better. But there's a lot of potential, and we know that we can change the way that narratives work, that stories play out, if we are intentional about our communications. So we've seen that for a long time in this country, we were really stuck in a story, a dominant story of welfare and benefits that was deeply harmful and completely inaccurate, and it looked and sounded a bit like this. Where is the fairness, we ask, for the shift worker leaving home in the dark hours of the early morning who looks up at the closed blinds of their next door neighbour sleeping off a life on benefits? So this was George Osborne 10 years ago, talking to the Conservative Party conference. And this quote really sums up, and I think is a clear illustration of that driver scrounger narrative that was everywhere for a long time. We had it in Benefit Street, we had it in political kind of media news across the political spectrum, but we also had it in kind of public conversation more generally, this sense of this, you know, it's drivers versus scroungers. And I want to be clear that I don't think that we are as deeply steeped in this story. I'm not saying this story is completely gone away, but the narrative terrain has shifted in the last 10 years. And the research backs this up. So British Social Attitudes Survey asked people whether they agree or disagree with this statement. If welfare benefits weren't so generous, would people learn to stand on their own 2 feet? And in 2013, more than half of people agreed with this statement. Last year, only 36% agreed. So that's still too high. There's still a lot of work to be done. But we don't hear this story expressed in this way so much anymore. And even when there was talk of changing the approach to benefits and welfare in the budget statement last week, it was not framed in this kind of very stigmatizing, very punitive way. So I think that we have moved to a place where this story, the George Osborne driver scrounger story, no longer dominates, and there is different work to be done in terms of how we move the conversation forward. So I'm going to give another kind of media-based example of where I think there is a real conflict in how issues are framed and how issues are understood, and where I think there's a lot that we still need to do and a lot of potential that our storytelling needs to deliver on. And that is summed up by a recent media exchange between Martin Lewis and Edwina Currie, which I'm going to play you a short clip from. But for those of you not familiar, this was a conversation that was all about the solutions, the cost of living crisis and the solutions to the energy crisis. And what you see is Edwina Currie promoting a very kind of individual focused message. And you see Martin Lewis, ironically, as a kind of consumer champion, and become increasingly frustrated with the solution she's promoting.
Here's one of my questions for
I'm really sorry to talk across you, but we've got 1 or 2 people asking if we could slow it down slightly, please.
Yes, sure. I'm sorry. I'll do that. Are there any? Does anyone want me to go back and talk through a different slide, or should we press on and we can maybe pick some stuff up in questions? I'm going to pause after this one for questions. I'll crack on for now, and then please do shout with anything you'd like me to go back to.
Tip, something that's dirt cheap. Martin knows about this sort of thing. If you put some of this behind your radiators, it really works. It makes the whole room nice and warm, and it means that you can turn down your thermostat without it causing you any more discomfort. I mean, you know, Martin, Susanna, most people my age have lived in houses without central heating, but we are dependent on it now. And just that kind of little thing makes such a difference. Moving the sofa away from the radiator. You don't want to be heating the sofa, you want to be heating the room. If you've got
Edwina, forgive me, there's nothing wrong with
that kind of thing, you know.
There's nothing wrong with the tips, and the tips are right, and there's lots of great detailed tips out there. But ultimately, let's be plain. We have an 80% rise in the price cap in October. We have another predicted 52% rise in the price cap in January. We're 7 months through the 10-month assessment period of that, so that's likely to be in the right ballpark. That will bring a typical bill in the UK to £5,400 a year. Many pensioners, you're talking pensioners, tend to have big...
So I'm going to pause there, and just to kind of sum up what's going on here. You know, this is a competing kind of battle of the frame of kind of individual versus individual responsibility versus a more systemic responsibility. So Martin Lewis is talking about the rising cost of energy and the impossibility that that presents for many people when it comes to kind of heating their house and keeping themselves and their families afloat. And he is pointing out the ridiculousness of Edwina Currie suggesting that, you know, tinfoil down the back of the radiator is going to be in any way adequate in terms of addressing the cost of living crisis. And this echoes a kind of ongoing battle in framing terms of who is responsible for you know, for dealing with rising cost of energy, for dealing with rising cost of living. Is it down to the individual, or does the system need to be, do we need to look to the system? And that's something we're going to pick up on in terms of the research that we did around social security and how we can move the conversation to more systemic terms. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and come back to the group and see if there's any questions from anyone. And apologies if I've been going a bit fast through the presentation. Okay, I'm just checking the questions that I've had sent through. The strive deserving poor versus non-deserving poor dates back to Victorian England. Can we realistically get rid of it quickly? So that's a really good question from Darren. Thank you. And I think, you know, the way I look at this is that it is much easier culturally and cognitively for us to assume that an individual is responsible for addressing society's problems, and that this is all about hard work. It is much more available to us to look to the individual than to look to the system. And that you're right, that dates back, you know, it goes deep into our culture. And it's a story, you know, people sorting themselves out, you know, working harder is a story that's very available to us. But what we see, I think, over time is that we can shift the conversation and we can shift awareness of the systemic responsibilities and the need for the system to change such that it's not so dominant. I think you're probably right, Darren, that we probably can't kind of altogether get rid of the idea that actually individuals, you know, have a responsibility, and actually we want to live in a society where everyone has agency and everyone is afforded agency. But I think what we're trying to do is to encourage a conversation that prompts much more recognition of and looking towards the system to change, rather than pointing the finger or pointing blame often at individuals. And I think what we've seen over recent years, starting before the pandemic, but certainly kind of being sustained through it, is that we have moved somewhat away from the kind of worst articulation or the most punitive and most blame-fueled articulation of that strive for grandeur story. And I think we've got more work to do, and the research we're going to share, I think, offers some tools and some tips in terms of thinking how we can push the conversation further towards helping people think about systemic responsibility. I will go back to my my questions. Would it be possible to have the slides afterwards, please? Yes, absolutely. That's an easy one. How can we shift towards the need to change the system without denying the agency of those in poverty? That's a great question, and I hope that the research that we'll share will help to answer that. I think that it's always about being able to show how people exist in a context. So you're not trying to kind of move people away from thinking about individual experiences and individual agency. We're always trying to widen the lens so that we can actually see the system that surrounds us and the way that that impacts on people's lives. Okay. Sorry, I'm just reading the questions. I think some of the ones we're getting will be answered more when we come to looking at this piece of research in particular. I wondered if anyone has any questions, and I'll look into the chat around the sort of the point around framing the debate and being able to kind of claim the have more influence on the way the debate is presented. Okay. Question from Austin, who says, if fake news is based on incidents and repetition through social media at a huge scale, how can we address this through a strategy that is less based on repetition? So my answer to that question would be to say, I think that the fact that we as human beings respond to information, or are more likely to respond to and remember information that is repeated frequently, is not something we can change. We can't change the way that our brains work and the way that our brains receive and interpret information. And actually, it kind of makes sense that the more we've heard something, the more familiar it is to us, the easier it is to process, the more we're likely to believe it's true. I think the way that we can respond to that is that we can tell stories effectively, we can communicate issues in effective ways, and we can be more repetitive in our communications, because often what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of drown out an unhelpful story that's been told and repeated since long before any of us were born, and we're trying to replace that with quite kind of detailed information that's less easy for people to hear. And actually we need to do a little bit of being a bit more repetitive and repeating the same core ideas over and over, such that they come to be and to feel more normal to people. So I think it's about embracing repetition when we're communicating for change, rather than actually trying to change the fact that repetition is so important. Yes, replace it with a repetitive truth. Beautifully put. Thank you, Darren. Okay, I think that might be a good point for me to carry on with my presentation. I'm going to now talk through kind of what we heard in the piece of research that we did over the summer, which really tried to dig into how do people think and feel about the social security system, and how can we talk about the social security system in effective ways. So we'll stop again for reflections and questions once we have been through the next section. So I'm going to share my screen again. And please do, if I'm talking too quickly, please do tell me off, and I will try to make sure that I slow down. Okay. Okay, so what we did in the research, the first thing that we were looking at was, what are we trying to achieve with frames and messages? What do we need them to do? What do we need people to hear and to understand? So to answer the question of what we're trying to achieve with this piece of communications research, we turned to the Commission's plan on social security, and we looked at their analysis and recommendations, and we used that as the basis of everything else that followed. So we were looking for language and ideas that increase people's support for a guaranteed decent income for everyone, for raising child benefit, and for a new approach to disability benefits. But we're, as well as those specific policy proposals, we're also looking for kind of how do we find frames and messages that allow people to connect with the principles on which the Commission's plan is based. So respect and dignity for all, and a much more collective approach to how we support people in society. So it's about the specifics of the policy proposals, but it's also about these kind of fundamental values and principles that the Commission is working so hard to advance. And to kind of gauge public perceptions and to test messages, we started off by reviewing communications and framing insights from the last few years. There've been quite a few different studies and reports and pieces of research looking at public attitudes, looking at messages, looking at framing. So we reviewed everything that had already been done in an attempt to make sure that we didn't reinvent anything, or we didn't duplicate anything. We developed messages to test. And the first thing that we did is we ran 2 online focus groups featuring first an open discussion around these issues. So we brought up the, talking about what's happening at the moment with the cost of living. We brought up the specific solutions that the Commission is trying to advance around changes to the welfare system, and we, asked people what they thought. And once we'd kind of seen how people were tending to talk about these issues and tending to react and think, we started to introduce some different types of messages to see how people started, if they talked differently, if they felt differently, how they reacted to the ideas we were putting in front of them. And having run those discussion groups where we're, much more open and allowing for a conversation, a structured conversation to be had, but we're hearing people talk in real time and analysing how they're thinking and feeling about these issues. We then carried out a survey experiment where we looked at the ways that different frames and messages affected people's thinking and whether or not different frames and messages were shifting people's support for the Commission's proposals. I will come back to exactly what we did there, but really this was about kind of testing whether different ways of messaging the Commission's plan had some were more effective than others. So I'll talk a little bit more about what we did. But here's a few of the people who were involved in our focus groups. So we had people from around the country, a range of different experiences. We made sure that we talked to people who had more experience of the benefits system and people who had less experience of the benefits system, and we really were trying to make sure that we kind of we talked to people who a diversity of viewpoints, a diversity of experiences. And what we heard in those focus groups, and I'm just going to run through a few slides talking about kind of the big themes and the big notes that we had based on those conversations. And I've got some quotes from some of the participants that illustrate some of the themes that we were coming up against. So it won't surprise anyone to hear that the cost of living crisis dominates how people are thinking and experiencing these issues at the moment. So just a couple of quotes to show that how people were summing this up. People don't have enough money coming in to cover what has to go out. So very strong, clear sense that is simply not enough money coming in to cover what has to go out. And that seemed to be widely accepted and widely understood and widely felt by everyone we spoke to in our focus groups. We heard people are going to really struggle, even those who haven't before. So we ran these focus groups towards the end of the summer. So there was, a lot of talk about the cost of living crisis. It was starting to bite, but in terms of people's sense of the kind of rising cost of energy and how that was going to affect people in the autumn and winter, there was a very strong sense that there was worse to come. So this sense that worse was to come, but also this was going to affect more people than were currently experiencing hardship. So we saw through these conversations that there was much more awareness of some of those structural causes of hardship. So, when we think back to that conversation between Martin Lewis and Edwina Curry, it really does feel as if most people are thinking much more in terms of the structural causes of hardship than the individual causes or solutions. But given that this is all being seen through the lens of the kind of cost of living crisis and the specific moment that we're in right now, there's a risk that this might be seen as a kind of one-off or a moment rather than something that's a long-term trend born of kind of political choices and born of decisions about how our society works. So it is definitely clear that people are very aware that this is not a matter of people needing to work harder, and that they're much less likely to talk in kind of stigmatizing language. But there's a risk that people are identifying that this is what's happening right now, rather than this is something that has deeper roots. And there's also a fractured sense of who is most responsible. So people are looking to and talking about landlords, employers, different government departments, and they're referencing a range of things when we ask about solutions, and there's a really kind of fractured sense of who should lead on fixing things. So whilst it's good that people are looking to a real range of different kind of people and institutions for responsibility, there's also a sense of kind of fractured responsibility, a sense this is kind of everyone's responsibility and therefore no one's responsibility, and that it's difficult for people to think clearly about the specific things things that, you know, government should be doing to lead on, you know, supporting people through the cost of living crisis and beyond. And perhaps related to this, you know, people are really disillusioned with politics and institutions. You know, this has come through in other pieces of research I've been involved with, and it is extremely stark, and it's hard to overstate just how fatalistic people feel and disillusioned people feel about politics and about institutions. So lots of people were talking in scathing terms about what the government was doing and not doing, and then they'd go on to say, well, I voted for them, and you know, this is just the politics that we have now. So people are, you know, struggle to attribute responsibility to or leadership to the government, because they just don't think that that could change or the government could do anything different. So there's a job to do to overcome this sense of disillusionment and to instill a sense that things could be different. I think that's probably the key point there, is that people think this is just how it is, as there's work to do to kind of overcome that and allow people to think about how it doesn't have to be like that, like it is at the moment. So what we did was we then brought the conversation, you know, more specifically to the social security system. We had to bring up the social security system for people to talk about it. It wasn't a top of mind thing that people automatically mentioned. It had to be, you know, we had to ask in order for this to come up in the conversations. And when we did, we saw that younger people were less familiar with the term and the principles upon which it's based. Older people kind of instinctively knew what the social security system was and what it was all about, but it seemed to be less established in younger people's minds. And we also saw this tendency for people to think more individualistically when we talked about the social security system. They brought up stories and they saw things through the lens of detailed, individual personal experiences, either their own or those of their family or members of their family or friends, and they were much less likely to think about widely shared collective experiences. They really did see the social security system through the lens of what happened to me that one time or what I heard from somebody I know. They didn't think about a kind of a wider system that everybody is connected to. Yeah, people struggle to think about and reflect on how the system works as a whole and the potential for it to be any different. But the good news is that when we shared some of the Commission's recommendations, many people agreed with them and many people actually wanted more ambition. So they welcomed the Commission's specific recommendations, they agreed with them, and some people said, well, I think it should go even further than that. I think we should be more ambitious about how we support people. So the point here is that we had to bring it up. People didn't gravitate automatically to thinking in terms of the solutions that the Commission is recommending. But when we did, there was strong support for the ideas and the specific policy proposals. So a couple more kind of reflections on how people were thinking about social security. The first one is that when people support a stronger welfare system, they believe that this is an abnormal or unusual position to hold. They assume other people don't want a stronger social security system. So this is a slightly convoluted point, but it's really, really important that people think they are an outlier when they are supporting a stronger social security system. So a quote that sums this up: I know a lot of people don't agree with this, but I do. So somebody saying, I agree with what you're proposing in terms of strengthening the social security system, but I don't think other people would agree with that. People also worry that they or other people will be overlooked or deprioritized in favour of a specific group that they worry may be over prioritized. So this is something I've seen in other focus group conversations, that as soon as the conversation turns to a particular group who might have particular needs, there's a fear that others will lose out. So there's a sense that this is a kind of zero-sum game, and if anyone wins, other people will lose. So a direct quote from the focus group is that help needs to be for a range of people, not just a specific group. So we really need to help people to think about the collective experience for everyone, rather than to feel that this is about different types of people competing with each other. Okay, I'll talk through what we learned from the message testing that we did, and then I will pause for more reflections and questions, and then I'll let us have a break. Okay, so the message testing process that we went through, we developed 8 messages that talked about the Commission's proposals in different ways. So we were testing 8 different ways to try to bring the Commission's proposals to life for people, and for them to feel more enthusiastic about what the Commission had to say. And these were all, this was carried out after the focus groups, so this was all based on what we'd heard, and these were 8 different messages that we thought had some potential to be persuasive for people. So we gauged how people felt and whether they supported policy solutions without hearing a message. So we gauged how people thought when we just presented the Commission's proposals in fairly neutral, kind of standard ways. And then we gauged how different people responded to the same questions once they'd heard one of the messages. So we're testing whether or not hearing a particular message makes people more likely to support the policy solutions and the approaches that the Commission is advocating for. And we also asked people to indicate which parts of the messages resonated most with them, if any did. So we were able to see whether these messages were persuading people to support the types of solutions that the Commission is advocating for, but we also were looking at whether people, when they read it, they felt they agreed with it. So, we were saying to people, what jumped out at you from this message? Highlight the passage of text that you agreed with. So the tested messages, I'll run through these fairly quickly, but not that quickly, because I want to be clear that not everything we tested worked brilliantly. Some performed better than others. We tested a concept of updating the social security so it's fit for today's challenges. So we're talking about how the social security system has not been changed and updated and upgraded to move with the times, to be fit for what we need it to do today. We tested talking about the social security system as a public service to support us all, especially when we're struggling. So this is the idea of it being both universal and targeted. So really clear, a public service to support us all, especially when or if we're struggling. We also tested a message emphasising the government's responsibility to look after us all. So, looking at how people tended to feel quite disillusioned with politics and with what the government can do. We tested a message that was all about kind of leading with and trying to prime a sense that actually the government does have responsibility and they should be acting. We tested a message that talked about a kind of practical, common sense approach that invests in the future. So trying to make the point that it's actually not very sound kind of logic and common sense to not have a decent social security system, and then instead we need to approach this in practical ways. We tested a message that talked about the social security system as a scaffolding around which people can build decent lives. So this is really this idea of trying to help people to look to the system, but to see that the system should be affording people a greater degree of agency and control over their lives. We talked about how the social security system should loosen the financial constraints that stop many people from thriving. And we talked about how the social security system is falling short. So we told a story that was really focused on everything that is going wrong and not working with the social security system as it stands. We also tried a message that was all about spotlighting an existing programme, so looking at child benefit and looking at the way that child benefit works and the way that it could be improved. So we're really trying to kind of bring to life the idea of the overall system via a particular example. And what we found is that it was the top 3 in this list that were most effective in the testing that we did. So I'm going to focus on those are the basis of what we're recommending. And just to recap, they were that we need to update the social security system so it's fit for today's challenges. We talked, we saw that the message around this is a public service to support us all, especially when we're struggling. The universal and targeted message was also effective, and the idea that the government has a responsibility to look after us all. And when it came to this question of what people selected as having resonated with them and what people highlighted, the most resonant language, the bit that large numbers of people said was very compelling, was this piece of text. We all rely on our public services, from the NHS and education to child benefit. These services, especially the social security system, support us all to get by, even if we fall on hard times. So these were the kind of the messages that proved effective in the testing and that proved resonant. After we've had another chat and another break, I'm going to run through the ways that we have interpreted this to form some recommendations for people communicating these issues, which draw on what we learned through this testing. But before we do that, we've heard what kind of members of the public found resonant. I thought I would ask you to share one thing that's resonated with you, or anything that you'd like to make sure we cover after the break, or indeed if there's any questions on what I've shared so far. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and return to, I can't see, but I can see the chat. Okay. See some questions. Okay. A debate in the chat around the language to use and around the word entitlements, welfare and benefits. Okay, so yeah, we do have a specific recommendation around language, which I will come on to in part 3, but I'll mention now since it's come up, which is we think, based on this research, that talking about the social security system is probably the best way to go, and moving away from talking first about kind of welfare or benefits. I certainly wouldn't recommend using the word entitlement, and the reason for that is that, you know, the social security system, for people who the people who immediately understand the social security system, it has very positive connotations, and it connects people with a deeper sense of what this is all about and why it matters. And it doesn't have the kind of stigmatizing associations that language around kind of benefits and welfare can have for some people. So we think that actually there's a job to do to keep using social security system so that more people connect with it, understand what it is, and that it's kind of reclaimed as language that can effectively frame what this is all about and how this system should work. I'm sure there'll be more questions around that, and there's possibly more work to be done to explore how that works in practice. But based on this piece of research and what we reviewed elsewhere, we think there's a lot of potential for social security system as really effective language. Okay, I'm going to turn back to the questions. Insights around, okay, yep, social security versus, yep, okay, and if younger people weren't as clear on social security as a term, how can we helpfully build that understanding? That's exactly how I see that. The job to do now is to build deeper understanding of what the social security system means and how it works and how it can support us all as a society. Again, you know, how can we do that? Well, I will turn to the recommendations in the next section, and, you know, using this point about repeating the same ideas. You know, if people have heard stigmatizing language around benefits and welfare, let's not use that language. Let's not try to kind of repeat that language in order to disprove it. Let's keep repeating the ideas and the language that does work, and let's keep telling that news story, and let's be repetitive with our truth telling. So next question, how can we frame these in trade union friendly language to get all trade unionists behind this, not just disabled trade union members? Okay, I'll ask if I can speak slower. Sorry, it's a really bad habit of speaking too fast, but I will try my hardest to slow down. So I think that's a good question about how can we frame these recommendations in ways that get lots of different people on board. And my response to that is to say the first thing to do is to start using this language ourselves, because when effective frames and language is used, it can become quite contagious. People can see that that is working, that that is an effective way to talk, and that they will start repeating those ideas and that language. So the first thing I would say to do is to use the frames and use the effective language yourself. And then the other solution to that is more events like this, more workshops, more discussions, more kind of coming together and reflecting on the language we use and the way that we communicate, and exploring different ways of doing it. So putting the time in to actually recognise the power of the language that we use, and to afford ourselves the opportunity to think about how we use this tool as much as we can. Okay, somebody said just the idea that myth busting is counterproductive is really helpful. Thanks, Teresa. That is really helpful to hear. I, since being involved in this type of research, I agree that it's game changing to recognise that actually we need to tell our own truth in effective ways rather than to try and rebut other people's truths, because as soon as we do that, we're accepting that frame, and we're living within it rather than actually establishing a different way of talking and thinking about these issues. Okay, so I've had another couple of questions. How is it that pensioners' benefits, they are benefits of the sort, are seen as very acceptable? This is despite the fact that nowhere near all pensioners have paid into the system. They tend to get many extras to help them, so are usually in a better place than working age people. So that's not something that we looked at in this research. We didn't look at the kind of specifics of how people think about pensioners or others. We really did we recognized that people had a tendency to automatically divide people into groups and to worry that certain groups were being prioritized over others. And what we were trying to do was we were trying to find language and frames that reduced the likelihood of people doing that. So we're trying to move people as quickly as possible to a very collective orientation and thinking about the bigger picture, thinking about everyone as a whole, instead of immediately going to who they do and don't place value on. Somebody said, can we use rights as a term? Everyone has a right to food and shelter. Would it help to place greater emphasis on security in the framing? Okay, so when it comes to rights, it's not something that we tested in this piece of research. Based on other research that I've been involved with and other kind of projects of this nature, I would advise against everyone has a right to food and shelter as the language that is likely to be effective. It often doesn't work in the way that we want it to work or that we assume it is going to work. And I think there are other things that our framing needs to do that saying everyone has a right to food and shelter is simply not going to accomplish. So again, we can come back onto that after the break and after we've looked at the recommendations. Okay, next question. Why do you not approve of social security entitlements? So again, it's not something that came up in this research, but my instinctive reaction to that question is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to frame the system as a whole. So we're trying to talk about the social security system and the many ways that it provides support for all of us in society, especially when we need it most. Is that the word entitlements may activate a way of thinking that is closer to the sort of striver scrounger welfare type debate that we really want to be moving away from. I think when people hear the word entitlements, they think about whether people are entitled. It puts the conversation in that sort of space rather than actually talking about the overall system, talking about the way that it can support and serve the whole of society. So it's obviously a technical term that's we need to use in certain contexts. But in terms of what this work is all about and the big picture and the principles that you're trying to bring to life and to make live for everyone, I think the word entitlements is probably not super helpful. Okay. How do you overcome the hostility of the structural, powerful right-wing media to those who deem to be shirkers rather than strivers? So let's put a pin in that one and come back to that one. I think that I absolutely accept the point around the kind of the influence of the media discourse and the media narrative around this. And I think the job that we have to do is to tell a different story that actually reflects how most people think and the type of system that most people actually do want and the way that most people think about each other. And instead of trying to kind of, overcome or point out or call out that kind of hostility, we need to drown out that story with a completely different story that really focuses on the collective and on the way that the system can and should work. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about in terms of the recommendations that we're making on the back of the research. If there are other questions, I can throw them into the final round of questions. But for now, I'm going to allow everyone a quick break. I'm going to go and grab a quick cup of tea. And if we can come back at 11 minutes past 3, that would be great. And I'll also review the chat in that time, so I make sure that I'm not missing out on any more questions. And I'm going to try not to talk too fast when we come back after the break. Thank you very much.
Just a quick check the mic's working.
Hi everyone. I'm going to start back shortly. I'll just check to see. Great, Hayley's back. Fab. Okay, so before I share the final slides, I'm going to just take a couple of the questions that came up a couple of times. The first one is an easy one. Is there a publicly available written report pointing to some of these insights that we can share with partners and colleagues? Yes, we do. I should have said we've got a report that we will link to at the end of this session. I would link to it now, but I don't want everyone to be reading it. I want you to be engaging in the conversation we're having. So that will be shared in the chat and sent round after the event. The second question that I wanted to answer was the one that was asked at the very end, which is, would you advise we do work to track, dissect and understand the opposition's narrative? So my answer to that is yes. It's always helpful to understand what frames and narratives we're living in, we're up against, we're working within. But I think it's more important to understand how our own communications can and should work. So, and we can often get kind of consumed by an analysis of what other people are saying and how damaging it can be and how inaccurate it can be. And actually, I think there's a lot of work that we can do to actually recognize the power of our own communications and our own stories. And so I think we need to give more time to actually disseminating our own stories, telling our own stories, establishing our own language and putting that out into the world. So my answer to that is yes, but let's also kind of use these insights and run with them. And then the other thing I wanted to pick up on was that there were a few more questions around the word entitlement. That seemed to be something that was kind of giving people pause around. And I want to be really clear on why I would not recommend this be a word that we use and lead with in communications. And that's because if you, because of the word entitled and what that makes people think. So I did a quick Google search. The dictionary definition of entitled is believing oneself to be inherently deserving of privileges or special treatment. We all know that the social security system, the welfare system, doesn't work like that and is not set up to work like that. But people can come to believe that actually the social security system is all about kind of entitled people demanding privileges and special treatment that they don't deserve. And therefore, we should not accept this as the terms of the debate. If we're having the conversation about the word entitlement, the word entitled, anything that calls to mind the idea of privileges and special treatment, this is not a productive conversation to be having. We need to move the terms of the debate elsewhere, and we need to intentionally frame a story that doesn't kind of contest this idea, but instead lands a different idea. And that's what the recommendations that I'm going to talk through now are all about. Again, we can come back to this. Was there some issues? Nicky, we're not seeing you on the screen. Might be hard for anyone lip reading. Is that still true? Shall I can turn my camera off and switch it back on again. Sometimes that seems to work. I'll give that a try. Okay. Okay, am I back now for everyone? Oh, you can see me. I can see. Okay. Yep, great. I think enough of you can see me. And hopefully for those of you, if I do flip in and out a bit, it's because of a temporary blip rather than because I've gone anywhere. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Here we go. And I'm going to talk through now what we are recommending in terms of the language that worked, the ideas that worked, and how you can apply this to your communications. So the first thing is a quick example of a winning message. So this is a kind of a summary, a distillation of what we believe based on this research is a really effective way of talking about the social security system. So more and more people are calling for the government to upgrade the social security system so that everyone, especially those who most need it, can thrive in today's world. So this is doing some particular things. The colour coding is to highlight the fact that there are some specific moves being made in this framing. The pink is talking about, how more and more people want a stronger social security system. The blue is being very intentional about pointing out the government's responsibility, which was something that we heard was effective. The green is using this language upgrading or updating. The purple is intentionally using the language social security system, which, as we've talked about, we think has a lot of promise as the way we can, the name that we can give the system and that we can keep repeating. The yellow, everyone, especially those who need it most, was some of the most, was the message that proved most effective in the testing and the one that most resonated with most people. So we think this, again, is a really, really effective phrase. So I'm going to walk through the different moves that we're making here, and then I'm going to share a longer, because this isn't kind of obviously everything that we need to say, but I'm going to share a longer example of a persuasive message. So the first thing that this is doing is it's really centering the system. We talked about how people the social security system is not top of mind for people. So we need our framing to help, push it up there and make people more likely to think about the social security system. And specifically using this language of how the social security system is for everyone, especially when we need it most. So why do we need to do this? Why center the system? People don't automatically think about the social security system. They don't think about its role and its potential, even when the conversation is all about economic hardship. So we had to ask questions that got to the social security system, even when we were asking people about the cost of living crisis, even when we were asking people about the solutions to the cost of living crisis. It's not there, it's not top of mind, it doesn't roll off people's tongue. Therefore, our communications need to do that work for us. They need to put the idea of the social security system in people's heads and need to be very intentional about centering that and bringing it to life. Because the good news is that when prompted, people do have pride in the concept of a social security system, but we need to help people to connect with that sentiment. And therefore, if we talk explicitly about the system, we can help move away from more kind of individualistic thinking and, stories and reflections on one person's experience rather than how the system should be set up to work for everyone. As we've talked about, we're recommending calling it the social security system, but explaining what you mean by that and bringing to life how the system could and should work. So this is a horrible, cheesy image, but I used it intentionally because I think it says something about what we're trying to do here, that often these issues can be quite woolly and fuzzy for people, and it can be unclear what's going on or how something should work. So if we're thinking about our communications as a lens, we are trying to help people to see the social security system more clearly and more sharply, and we're trying to bring that into focus for people. So an example of somebody who is very good at talking about the social security system aspects of it, from a couple of years ago, this was when Marcus Rashford was running his campaign. He said, "The system isn't built for families like mine to succeed." Marcus Rashford has called on the government to reverse a decision not to provide free school meals vouchers during the summer. So what this quote from Marcus Rashford is doing is it's putting the system first. The system isn't built for families like mine to succeed. He could have said something like, families like mine are struggling at this time, but instead he centers the system and he puts that first. And it's a really good example of what we need to do more often when it comes to talking about hardship, talking about cost of living crisis, talking about the changes that we need to make as a society to support more people to thrive. Put the system first and bring it to life. And this language, support for everyone, especially when we need it most. I've said this already, but I'll emphasize it again. was extremely potent and resonant for people. A really, really high proportion of people who experienced this, who read this frame, read this language, selected this as what they believed to be really resonant and compelling. It's a straightforward, down-to-earth explanation of provision that is both universal and targeted, but it crucially doesn't use the words universal or targeted, which I think can be a bit sort of jargony and a bit harder to process. It's a much easier way of summing up what we mean when we're thinking about universal and targeted provision. It really resonated for people because it's clear, it's reassuring, it helps overcome this idea that people are worried about being overlooked in favour of another group. Actually, it's saying, no, it's for everyone, especially those people who need it most, or especially at times when people need it most. It's very instinctive. Some people need more support at certain times. And for people who are worried that we are talking about a system that provides support for everyone, especially when we need it most, and that actually doesn't measure up with what the system's doing at the moment, I absolutely hear you. And my reaction to that would be to say that we need to talk about what the system should be doing before we highlight where it's falling short. We need to reconnect people with what, how this system should work. Because of this kind of pessimism, fatalism, disillusionment with politics, if we lead with, and all we say is how the system is falling short, without first establishing the way that it should work, people simply give up and they don't believe things can be different, and they're not kind of persuaded to believe in better. So this is my kind of plea here, that when we're framing and we're thinking about what we need to repeat, this is the phrase that needs much more airtime. We need to lodge this in everyone's mind, that the social security system needs to provide support for everyone, especially when we need it most. Okay, second recommendation is around normalizing support. So we had that quote where in the focus group, somebody said, I support this, but I know lots of people don't. People really felt that if they were supportive of policy change that was more supportive, they were supportive of the kind of the types of thing that the Commission is advocating for, that they were not normal, because normal people don't like the benefit system, normal people don't like the welfare system. And when we think that that's a normal perspective, that's a really tough kind of story to challenge, and you know, the wrong story is being normalized, the wrong perspectives are being normalized, because what we think is normal matters. As humans, we are highly susceptible to what we think other people think. So a quote that sums this up nicely from some psychologists: what we think, feel and do is influenced, often to a startling degree, by what we believe everyone else is thinking and feeling and doing. So what we think is normal matters. I can't say this strongly enough. And if we think that it's normal to blame and shame people who are in receipt of welfare, that perpetuates that story and that kind of approach. So we need to flip that story, and we need to change that story. And instead of people thinking, oh, I like this, but I'm not sure other people will, and you know, I know a lot of people don't agree with this, but I do. Instead, we need to change the story so it's people all over the UK want a stronger social security system. So we need to change what we are saying is normal, because otherwise we'll stay stuck in an unhelpful story that doesn't take us forward. The third kind of move that we're making with the framing here is talking about updating the system. So again, this proved really effective in the testing, this language of updating the system so it works for today's world. So people tend to push back or tune out when a message feels politically motivated or overly radical. This is something that we see on a lot of issues, but when people think, well, this is just the usual suspects saying what they'll always say, and I'm never going to agree with them because they're coming from a different perspective, it can just be a kind of dead end when we're trying to win people over to what we're advocating for. So we need to bypass this response. We need to to, again, have a conversation that doesn't go there, that doesn't get stuck in, who's motivated and by what, and is this too radical or is this too extreme? Because updating the system so it works in today's world is a very intuitive message. It just makes intuitive sense for systems to be updated so they work right now and they do the job that we need in today's world. But a watch out here is to avoid too much computer language. So when we veered too much into kind of anything that made people think about IT upgrades, it called to mind the idea of a kind of robotic, inhumane system and of sort of failed government IT upgrades. So language around upgrading, updating, fit for today's world is great, but let's not talk too much in language that makes people think about computers, because that's not helpful. And we need to remind people that the government has a responsibility over this. This is in people, but it needs prompting. So what we found is that whilst people were very disillusioned with politics and with the government, once we framed the issue in these terms, people responded well to that, and they said, okay, yeah, I agree, that is what the government is there for, that's what they should be doing. So as part of this, big up the solutions that you have. People are and can be for them, and they need to hear and think about and be given the opportunity to have conversations about how things could and should be better. So really, really important, don't leave your solutions to a kind of tiny mention at the end of a long conversation or a long piece of text. Actually put them front and center, put them in your communications, and make sure people get the opportunity to engage with the solutions that you have. Because when people do hear about them, they tend to be supportive of them. Okay, so I've got a longer example of a message which is doing the same things but in a longer form, which I will read through, and then we'll stop and we'll take any final questions or comments. Okay, people across the UK want an updated social security system so that everyone, especially those who need it most, can thrive. Social security is our society's approach to welfare, benefits, and state support. The system was designed to support everyone, but as times have changed, the government hasn't upgraded and updated it to meet modern challenges. There are a number of ways our governments can modernise the social security system so it responds to our society's needs. For example, and this is where you would insert a specific policy proposal, and you would elaborate on how it's going to work better. Our government has a responsibility to make changes like these to support all of us to get by. So that's just a slightly longer form version. It's doing the same things, but it's elaborating, and it's doing more. It's more explanatory. It's doing more work. It's particularly doing a little bit more about kind of building out the idea of upgrading and updating to meet modern challenges. And it's also kind of making sure that we explain what the social security system is. So the question that was asked earlier about kind of, does it matter that younger audiences seem to be less familiar with the social security system as a term? Yes, it does matter. So we need to make sure that where possible, we kind of bring to life and we explain what the social security system is. Okay, I think that is it for my slides, and we will share the slides afterwards along with the document, the written document that we've got with the recommendations in full. But I will now turn to the questions and see, okay, final questions. Okay. Yeah, uprating instead of updating. I meant to say updating. It's updating, not uprating. Don't say the word uprating. Okay, someone said, Teresa has said, I'm interested in the way that the system feels dehumanized. I think this is part of the issue. We upgrade as upgrades seem to mean less human contact. People who are struggling sometimes have multifaceted issues, and the human touch is downplayed. Yes, I would completely agree with that, Teresa. I think that's why, use these recommendations as a whole. I think if you only use the one kind of upgrading, updating example without some of the other frames, then it may, that you may run that risk. I think what you want to be doing is prioritizing this language around a system that works for all of us, especially those who need it most, and then be kind of moving into expand on the upgrading and modernizing point. But yeah, I agree there's a danger of missing that. So a question about spokespeople. Who will be the articulate, effective spokespeople on the media, changing the narrative on social security? It's a really good question. Words and ideas and language and stories can be powerful, but you have to actually say them and you have to actually get them in front of people for them to work. They don't work when they just sit on a PowerPoint presentation or even in a document that I'm going to send to you all. We have to get them out there. And my answer to this question is really, you need as many different people as possible echoing the same sorts of language, the same sorts of idea. You need to find those kind of leading, articulate, kind of persuasive people who can do the rounds in the media, but don't rely on a couple of people to win this. It's actually got to be something that's kind of owned and supported and championed by a wider group, and then you get the kind of echoing and the helpful repetitive effect. So yes, I don't know exactly who the spokespeople are or should be, other than to say I think that we can all be effective spokespeople, and now is the time for us all to kind of realise the power of how we all talk, which I think may link to Anna Rose's question. I'd love to believe in recognising the power of our story and that this would make a difference. This begs the questions: have we not believed enough? Have we not communicated it well enough? Or have we been consistently drowned by the dominant story, confirmed and repeated all but exclusively in the mainstream media? How do we explain the successful growth of inequality over decades? How does a change in believing counter such a powerful opposite story? How do we reach enough people, tens of millions, to shift this story? So I agree with a lot of what you're saying, Anna, and I think there is often a sense that we are at the mercy of a story or a frame that is set elsewhere. And sometimes that can feel true, and sometimes that is true. I believe that, if you have large numbers of people agreeing with the types of policies that you're recommending, and yet they don't believe that other people believe it, I think we have conceded the story, the big story. We have allowed that to be set, and we haven't been effective in actually allowing people to connect with this kind of collective systemic solution to hardship and to inequality. So I think it's really about embracing our ability to be effective, but also to recognise that it's not all bad news. The stats I shared with you from the British Social Attitude Survey showing that there's been quite a significant reduction in the number of people who instinctively believe in the sort of striver, scrounger story. Things can change. And I think it's about, for want of a better phrase, taking back control and recognising our power as communicators and our ability to shift the conversation forward and to move it further forward. Okay, more requests for the written document. We've got a very steep climb here because the message coming. Okay, so Joe says we've got a very steep climb here because the message coming from this government is that it is not their job to ensure people are okay. It is as all of us as individuals. Didn't a former DWP secretary say that it wasn't her job to stop people dying? So I didn't hear that specific quote or example, but I do agree that there is a job to do to activate this sense of government responsibility, of collective kind of thinking. But I think that for me, the the heartening insight I can share with you is that actually for people in the UK, these sentiments are there. People do deep down believe in a collective society, and they do deep down believe in government responsibility. And I think that when issues are presented to them as being collective issues with, you know, clear sense of how the government's responsible and what they can do, people are really, really persuaded by that. So I think that the job we have to do is not to attempt to counter everything, but it's to simply let people believe in the better society that we should have, and talk in ways that allow people to reconnect with that. And I think I used to work with researchers who did communications research all over the world, and they always said that in the UK there is a really strong sense of government responsibility compared to other countries. That's been kind of blurred. Like I said, that's a kind of blurry picture, and actually our job to do, and something we can do in our communications, is to kind of sharpen that up and allow people to reconnect with that. What did you say about the last slide, Nicky? You're speaking far too rapidly. The last slide I talked through was the example of the longer message, which I can put back up, and I can point out some of the things that is doing. I will go back to that. Okay, so this is the example of an effective longer message, and the features that I wanted to point out here were around how this is talking about what the social security system is there for and the principles upon which it is based. So this second passage, social security is our society's approach to welfare benefits and state support. This is really explaining to people what the social security system is, and it's bringing it to life for people who are maybe less familiar with that term. The other move that we're making here is we're kind of building out and elaborating on this idea of upgrading and updating the system so that it meets modern challenges, and allowing people to think about how, when times change, we need to change the way that we support people. And in our message testing, that proved really effective in terms of helping people to think about how the system could and should be different. It's obviously also talking about government responsibility. It's very clear on what the government can and should do, and it's explicit, this term, the government has a responsibility, and it's doing some of the other things we talked about, normalising. People across the UK want this, using this language of everyone, especially those who need it most, which I think, if I want you to remember one thing from what I've said today, there's one phrase that I would love for lots of people working in this space to repeat, to say again and again until you're sick of saying it and you're worried that people are sick of hearing it. It is this phrase here, social security system, so that everyone, especially those who need it most, can thrive. It's such effective. I was really surprised by just how kind of resonant and effective that was in the testing that we did. And I would really urge you all to kind of unleash the power of that kind of language. So I'll stop sharing my screen again. I hope that was a bit clearer. I am sorry for moving too fast. Okay, just see if there's any final questions. Yeah, so Sarah says it's very inspiring to hear that people have deep beliefs that we can tap into and reconnect with their own beliefs. This is a leadership role, and it can be radical rather than feeling we just have to follow public opinion. I think that's a really nice summing up of what I've attempted to say, which is, this isn't necessarily about kind of meeting people where they're at, kind of calling people out if they don't agree with us. It's about unleashing something that is in most, if not all of us, but that often we've been led to believe we shouldn't have or we can't have. And one of the things that I felt when I was listening into the focus groups that we ran is that people feel quite alone. So people feel that their experience is quite singular to themselves. And actually what we need to do is allow people to recognise that they're not alone, and that actually there's a lot of people who are experiencing something similar, who want better. And I think that that felt really, really powerful to me. So using language to help people feel like they're part of something, and again, to kind of overcome divisions and a sense that you know, this is about prioritizing some people over another, actually being really intentional about this is support for everyone, especially those who need it most. Okay, I think that if there are any further questions that haven't been picked up on, do shout now. I wonder if Michael or anyone from the team that's organised the event wanted to jump in if anything they felt needed to be looked at again.
Hi, Nicky.
Hi, Michael.
I think Jamie has been copying for you questions from Fran Bennett and Baroness Ruth Lister. Not sure, can you see them?
Yeah, okay, I've got that now. Yeah, I think Fran is saying support for everyone, especially when we need it most, is different from support for everyone, especially those who need it most. I think there's probably times when you'd need to use both formulations, but I think we is generally better than them or they or those people. So I would definitely kind of err towards the former rather than the latter. But there might be times when we need to say those who need it most when we're speaking about people at particular times rather than kind of all of us all the time. So yes. Okay, so Rona's asked about what did you mean about how we have a responsibility to blur communications? That didn't make sense. Yes, so the irony of me trying to explain my blurry communications when I myself have been blurry is not lost on me. What I was saying is that people can think in quite fuzzy terms. So people have been presented with a blurry picture, and it's our job as communicators to help sharpen the focus, to help to be more specific, to be clearer about what can change, about who's responsible, about what the system that we do have, the ideals that it should live up to. And by kind of clarifying that, we can make things less blurry and we can put things into sharper focus. But again, I'm sorry that that wasn't clear in how I talked through that. Okay, so Claire's asked an interesting question. Do I think that the striving versus skiving narrative waned in the media due to the COVID impact, but that it has been reinstated? That's actually not sort of what the attitudes research has shown. The attitudes research showed that there was a lessening of that narrative and of people's belief in that narrative, even before the pandemic. So it wasn't necessarily all about the pandemic. I agree that the pandemic will have enabled people to think about society and collective responses to that moment. But even before the pandemic happened, there was we were seeing much less stigmatizing attitudes in how people were responding to these issues. So I think that the job we have to do is to sort of almost go deeper and to think about what are the deep sort of values and the deep beliefs that people hold, and how do we bring them to the fore. It's not about a pandemic or a cost of living crisis, about something that's deeper and more abiding than that. And we have a job to do to keep reminding people of the type of society that we we want to have, that we want to live in, and the principles that it's built on, and the fact that the government has a responsibility to live up to that. So yeah, it's not just about the pandemic. It's a longer term process and project than that. Okay, I think that it feels as if we are nearing the end, and the questions are kind of not coming through quite so fast now. Okay, I would still welcome your views on an emphasis on security in framing social security, as I've not answered that. Okay, apologies if I haven't picked that one up. So what we did was we used the term social security system because that was the term that the Commission were using, and we wanted to see whether that could be an effective way of talking about the system. And what I was actually quite skeptical. I thought that it probably wouldn't be a very resonant, clear or effective way of talking about the system, that people would struggle to connect with it and what it was. But it actually proved to be more promising and effective than I expected it would be. So for that reason, we are recommending language around the social security system. I wouldn't necessarily talk about security outside the context of calling it the social security system, but that term as the name for the system, we believe, based on this research, has a lot of potential and can help move the conversation away from some of the sort of more stigmatizing and less helpful connotations and associations that people have around kind of welfare benefits, deservingness, entitlements, all of that stuff that we really want to move away from. We didn't explore the term income support. I mean, the social security system should be providing security, but doesn't. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really what we're trying to, the whole of this project was about trying to establish the ideals that the system should be meeting, and the principles upon which it was founded that we should be, it needs to be changed to live up to. So I think that's really what the frames are doing, is that they are establishing and connecting people with how this should work and why this is a good thing, and why this is actually quite uncontroversial, really. This is just deep down something that we probably all believe, you know, this is the way that we believe society should work, and it's using communications in a way that allows people to connect with that, and then pointing out where improvements need to be made so that the system works as it should do. Okay, I think that I may suggest that we finish up now. I think that we're running a bit early, but I am wondering if we could send around the written document and move towards closing. I think, is it Jamie from Trust for London is going to share the link?
Hi, Nicky. Yeah, between me and Jamie, we'll do that. We'll put it into chat for everybody straight away. Brilliant,
thank you. And I think, yeah, thank you all for your questions and for your helpful participation. I'm really sorry if I was talking too fast. It's something I will try to work on, and I'll take that away from the session. So thank you.
And I don't call that Mike. Are you there? Are you going to do some closing comments on behalf of the Commission? Great.
Yeah, thanks very much. Osmond's been called away by one of the other projects that he volunteers with, so I'll be trying to fill in the gap. I'm Mike, another of the commissioners. You may have seen me at our events, and I certainly recognise many of the names attending today, and thanks for your support of this session. I hope everyone has found this webinar as interesting as I have. It's really been fantastic with some hugely important and helpful messages, which I hope we can all take away and use. A very big thank you goes to Nicky. The list of people I'm feeling in awe of is getting bigger. I'd also like to say thank you to Trust for London, City Bridge Trust and London School of Economics, whose support Osmond did mention earlier, and last but definitely not least, to our BSL interpreters, Hayley and Monica. And a very sincere thank you to each and every one of you for joining today's session. So the wrap-up question is, what's next? With the Commission, we always say, please start spreading the word. If you tell just one person about today's session, that's one more person who knows about it, or share what's been discussed today within your own networks, groups and organisations so that more people hear. Our networks and reach are often much more extensive than we realise. An email will be sent to you with the link to the recording of the webinar, and we're keen to work with others, so please do get in touch. You can reply to the email you received this morning or visit the website at www.commissiononsocialsecurity.org. So a big final thank you to everybody. And we'll now close the session, give or take that if you're like me, you have a terrible time exiting these meetings by finding the red button. Take care, everybody. Stay safe and well and happy. Talk to you soon.